It seems that we are all ready. So let's begin. 네, 여러분 안녕하십니까? 2024 인천 국제재난보건력 지도자 포럼 두 번째 날에 오신 모든 분들 진심으로 환영합니다. 저는 어제에 이어서 기쁘게 마이크를 잡은 아나운서 김민혜입니다. 먼저 이렇게 아침부터 귀한 발걸음으로 함께 해주고 계시는 모든 분들께 진심으로 감사하다는 말씀을 먼저 전합니다. Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the International Disaster Resilience Leaders Forum Incheon 2024. I am Min Hwa-kim and thank you for having me as your MC following yesterday. And first of all, we'd like to convey our appreciation for joining us this morning. 네, 오늘 벌써 저희 포럼의 두 번째 날입니다. 각국의 대표님들 그리고 전문가분들께서 주제에 대한 다양한 경험들과 지식들을 아낌없이 공유해 주신 덕분에 그야말로 저희 포럼이 서로를 통해서 배우고 또 함께 더 나은 미래를 모색하는 소통의 플랫폼으로 만들어 주셨습니다. Well, today marks the second day of the forum. And leaders and experts from various countries have shared their knowledge and experiences on the topic. So truly, you have made this forum a communication platform while we learn from each other. So thank you for that. 오늘은 시각을 옮겨서 도시 보건력을 위한 제도적 지원과 재난 위험 경감 정책 연구 활성화의 논의를 펼쳐갈 텐데요. 오늘 역시 값진 경험과 많은 지식 공유해 주셔서 더욱더 귀한 소통의 장으로 만들어 주시기를 부탁을 드리겠습니다. Today, we shift our focus to how to boost institutional effort and research effort for DRR. So without further ado, let's begin our session 3 under the theme of Enhancing Institutional Support for Urban Resilience. 네, 그럼 바로 세 번째 세션, 도시 보건력을 위한 제도적 지원 강화 세션을 지금부터 시작하겠습니다. 그럼 바로 이번 세션 좌장을 맡아주신 마를라 페탈, 세이브 칠드런 학교 안전 및 보건력 수석 고문님께서 무대에 나와 계시는데 여러분 큰 박수 부탁을 드리겠습니다. So without further ado, I introduce our moderator, Ms. Marla Petal, Principal Advisor for School Safety and Resilience, with a big round of applause. 박수로 여러분 다시 한번 맞아주시기를 부탁을 드리겠습니다. And now, invite all the speakers for the session to come up on the stage. 네, 그리고 모든 연사분들 세션 3를 풍성하게 채워주신 우리 연사분들 무대로 모시겠습니다. 여러분 역시 박수로 맞아주시기 바라겠습니다. Please. So all the speakers for this session, please come up on the stage. So welcome, and I would like to pass the microphone to Ms. Marla Petal, who will lead the session. The floor is yours.
Let's just check that it's working. Great, thank you. Would the interpreters raise their hands, please? I think you've been so wonderful and invisible. Where are they? In the booth. Okay, hiding. Okay, there we go, in the booth. Okay, so I'm just going to remind all the panelists today to please be really slow and methodical. If you're going to introduce an acronym, that is really hard on the interpreters. And I have a question for the audience before we dive in here. Yesterday, we heard a phrase used in English several times, and I'm really wondering how it works in Korean. The phrase was natural disasters. Would anybody from the audience who's fluent in Korean tell us how it works in the Korean language? Because we've had in the English language now for about 10 years a movement called #NoNaturalDisasters. The reason is because in English, the idea of natural is like coming from the cosmos, the universe, God, whatever, and is nothing that human beings have any impact on. Whereas we understand disasters to be something that human beings have tremendous impact on. So, can any of our experts out there just give us a little bit of information as we get started? How is it in Korean? Is there a difference between hazard and disaster in the Korean language? going to give you the mic here because it's going to be helpful, I hope, to all of us.
I will just explain what I know about Korea.
Just
Natural.
the difference between hazard and disaster in the Korean language.
We do use natural disaster by law. It's on the legislative term. However, in the academia section, the scholars agree that we have to change it, not avoid it instead of using a natural disaster to the natural hazard.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We have a similar problem in many places where natural disasters got codified and then it gets used over and over. So it's up to all of us to modify the language for everyone. Okay, so this session is pretty exciting. It's going to focus on the role of institutional and academic partners and networks in supporting local government capacity building for disaster risk reduction. It includes interventions from academic institutions and specialized agencies that support local governments in strengthening their capacity to implement disaster risk reduction actions, and will discuss the capacity development needs of local governments for DRR and efforts to address them. And I know that our panelists this morning are particularly interested in this, the part of the DRR, the last R, reduction, disaster risk reduction. So we're not going to be talking much in this instance about response preparedness, because we think of disaster risk reduction as the first, the biggest, the most important step. And when we do response preparedness, it's just to pick up the pieces of what we didn't accomplish with risk reduction. The session is going to be in the form of presentations. Each of our speakers is going to have 15 minutes, and they're going to be guided by questions about the key challenges that local governments face for capacity development, and how their institution supports capacity development, and how their institutions can support local governments in building their capacity. So I think they're going to have a lot of interesting ideas for you and things to follow up with afterwards. I'm going to just quickly introduce our speakers just for the first wave. Mark Pelling, professor at the Institute of Disaster Risk and Disaster Reduction at University College London. Give a wave, okay. Benjamin Ryan, professor at Belmont University in the USA. Jinqiang Chen, urban development specialist for climate change at the Asian Development Bank based in the Philippines. And Michelle Chivunga, chief executive officer of Global Policy House based in London. So without further ado, Mark, I'd like to turn the floor over to you. Mark has played a key role in bringing together the academic community to support disaster risk reduction capacity building. I think we've known each other for about 20 years now. I don't know how much longer we're in it for, but, and in particular through the iAsia working group on DRR that was set up last year.
Thank you, Marla, and good morning, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to join this conference and to speak with you this morning, as Marla said, on such an important topic. Let me start off by saying I have both a theoretical and a practical background in disaster risk reduction. Now, and I'm going to be talking very much from a personal perspective throughout this presentation. From a theoretical perspective, local governments are the most important set of institutions for disaster risk reduction, bar none. It is local governments that have the ability to integrate community action, national action, the private sector, all in a coordinated way. It's local governments that have responsibility for land use, for building regulation, often informing education, security, safety. So from a theoretical perspective, local government is where disaster risk reduction is won or lost. From a practical perspective, from one's observations, the capacities that local government need to achieve that theoretical opportunity are often very lacking. So there's an opportunity now in recognizing the importance of local and municipal governments to bring that together with the agenda for this conference on capacity strengthening to really and sincerely make a difference. So one could say we're in a period of possible transformation in the way the world is managing disaster risk reduction. So again, as Marla said, that's getting ahead of disaster risk, not responding, not preparing, but planning cities, planning local areas so that land use, building design, access to services, decision-making, rule of law, inclusion is creating cities, urban areas, towns that do not accumulate risk. So I'm going to just talk from my own perspective as an academic based in London on 3 different themes. And each of those themes, if you like, are places where one observes change. One observes opportunities in the way in which disaster risk reduction is institutionalized, is taught and learnt and researched within universities. So I'll talk about some of our experience at University College London. But then also the way in which research is done increasingly includes practitioners from local government and elsewhere in the design and the implementation of that work, so that capacity strengthening is not an add-on, but we might ask, can it be a driver for research? Can we design research in ways that is excellent, innovative, but leaves capacity, builds capacity amongst those people who need it, who frankly aren't the academics, it's the practitioners, and we know how important local government is. And then finally, to comment on the international opportunities for collaboration. So let me reflect a little bit on University College London and our own department, the Department for Risk and Disaster Reduction. And it's in the title of the department, Disaster Risk Reduction. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the world's first full academic department dedicated to disaster risk reduction. And you can see, I hope this doesn't sound like an advertisement, I'm just reflecting on what I know. So you can see from just some of the facts on the board there, the breadth of demand. And this is demand in the UK, but really driven by international demand, and particularly from South and Southeast Asia. What this really means is that there's, perhaps indicated by the formation of this Department for Risk and Disaster Risk Reduction, a shift in the way that we think about DRR, disaster risk reduction in training, away from disciplinary specialism, engineering, public health, geography, that allows at the end of the degree some specialism in DRR, perhaps through a research thesis, towards a whole degree dedicated to disaster risk reduction that may allow a specialism within disaster risk reduction at the end of that degree. So that completely inverts the way in which we as teachers and learners and then the young professionals think about disaster risk reduction. It turns disaster risk reduction into a professional practice for public policy rather than an add-on. We can see the proof for now in the numbers of those students. So we have a BSc degree, the first cohort was in 21, 75 students. It really astounds me that there are that many students willing to do this degree based in London. You see 35 of the students are international, which is a very high proportion for any degree, which again talks to the demand. Master's programs, we have 3, I'll talk to them in a second, but of the 80 students that we currently have across those degrees this year, 59 are international. So the international demand even higher for master's level, and then PhD students as well. We've got some data on the gender disaggregation there, which I think is also quite good. Is that there's a reasonable balance between the genders. There are a few images there, and I just wanted to emphasize one of the joys and challenges of teaching disaster risk reduction is that it is a theoretical and an applied subject. Our graduates need to be able to work professionally. That means we need to give them opportunities to build that professional expertise in their work. So there are a whole set of, yes, applied student projects, but internships, speakers, and opportunities to develop practice. Another challenge or joy of disaster risk reduction, and I think this was mentioned yesterday, is that the context or the experience of risk is always changing, always dynamic. Disaster risk is driven by development and development failure, by environmental change, by public health concerns, by technological innovation, by geopolitical relationships. So what we teach has to constantly be aware and oriented towards different expressions of disaster risk reduction. Our core mission remains the same, to reduce disaster risk in equitable and technically excellent ways. But of course that means a university that seeks to teach disaster risk reduction needs to have access to a whole range of disciplines, or perhaps a group of universities could do the same. And you see some of them there. In our own institute, we have a number of joint staff posts between ourselves and public health, between ourselves and engineering, specifically because of that purpose, that disaster risk reduction is a focal point that integrates many subjects across a university. So I mentioned this need for flexibility. The expression of risk is changing. Of course, we draw on many disciplines, but there are arguably some core components of disaster risk reduction education. These are our master's degrees. I just use it to distinguish those core from perhaps some of the more specific attributes, at least in our case, and there will be other ways of doing this. But we find that there are 4 core elements to any disaster risk reduction degree, 4 core skill sets. So the first is quantitative skill sets, an ability to understand how to quantify risk. The second is understanding vulnerability. This is both from an engineering perspective, physical vulnerability, loss reduction curves, if you're familiar with that language, and social vulnerability, the social drivers of sensitivity to exposure and loss. A third branch of this core discipline is around holistic approaches, the theory of disaster risk reduction, which draws on development studies, on political sciences, as well as the more physical interpretation of environmental change. And then finally, managing disasters, drawing, yes, from management sciences, but also much more applied experience. So this is exactly where we'd be inviting practitioners from the field to come in and teach our students. So those are 4 of the core attributes, we would argue from our experience, for teaching any kind of disaster risk reduction. Then there are specialisms around, the first strand is for academic research orientation, the second, building resilience, more physical hazards, which leads you to public policy, urban planning, humanitarian work, and the third, much more the science of hazards, much stronger on the quantitative, which might lead one to engineering or insurance. I'm sure I only have a couple of minutes left. So let me turn to the second of those 3 areas of innovation. This is encouraging researchers to shift from disaster risk reduction capacity strengthening as an add-on, a byproduct of research, towards it possibly being a driver for the motivation of doing research. We've been very lucky in a project that I've been able to talk to some colleagues here about called Tomorrow's Cities, a reasonably large project over 5 years. It's just finished. The mayor of Lalitpur is here in the audience, and Lalitpur was in fact one of the municipalities that originated this project and drove it forward. So thank you very much for your collaboration and your colleagues as well. The project was co-produced with colleagues like the mayor from 4 different countries, from Turkey, Nepal, Ecuador, and Kenya. Having co-designed the methodology, which is one way of bringing the practitioners in, we then built capacity strengthening modules. So when our methodology was fully developed, when we go to new cities, in fact, we don't simply go and deploy a methodology, we capacity strengthen local universities and local governments who then deploy the methodology. And we don't simply take the results, but actually we learn from their experience of deploying the methodology and change the methodology. So these colleagues are intrinsic key elements of the community of practice that we build every time we go to a new city, and we amend and we learn about our methodology through their experience. And the result of this is we have a very strong community of practice. You can see some of the information on the slides. I won't talk through it in detail. But more than 100 technical staff at local government and some national government levels trained and able to deploy this methodology, which is a state-of-the-art set of methodologies, and you can see some of the elements: normative visioning, GIS-based urban scenarios, multi-hazard impact assessment. We have a web app that describes the sorts of risk decisions that need to be taken. So it's a really applied and useful tool, but driven by the capacity that has been built through this experience. So at the end of this project, the research phase has finished, and we find we have 100 colleagues around the world who are really committed to continuing to work. And we are working with UCLG and UN Habitat, perhaps with UNDRR, Making Cities Resilient, to take these tools, take this community of practice into a second phase, one which maybe doesn't require research funding, but can be driven by local interest. So that's just one example of placing capacity strengthening at the heart. The third, final example is an opportunity to internationalize this movement of capacity strengthening as a core mission for the university and practical sectors. And this is one opportunity, and I would invite you all to be part of this. It's led by the International Association of Schools and Institutes of Administration, and UNDRR has been really instrumental in shaping this new international group and building it forward, which is, some of that is detailed on the slides. But in essence, IASIA is a network of schools of public administration, and they've formed a new working group. There are 10 existing working groups, all on very technical elements of public administration. This working group is on disaster risk reduction. Again, integrating disaster risk reduction is a core competency for public administration, not an add-on. Moving us forward to make that a reality then, the collaboration with UNDRR, with an MOU that was signed in Bloemfontein just a couple of months ago, is an initiative to help build a syllabus for undergraduate education for public administrators. This is a process that's just starting now. So, as I said, if that's something that interests you, please do get in touch. So let me just conclude then with 10 thoughts on what we've learnt through our experience at University College London and through Tomorrow Cities and through the international network on what is needed for successful integration of disaster risk reduction. We need interdisciplinarity, so reaching across that breadth of expertise. One needs work to be career-facing. We want to change the way that people work, enable careers. This isn't just a theoretical piece, but it has to be relevant to current risk and emerging risk concerns. I think it needs to be international. There is so much that can be learned from different parts of the world, particularly as one experiences rapid change, which might be more present in some parts of the world than others. So there's an awful lot to learn. It's important to be international, to be research-led. One needs to be at the forefront, the best technology, the best science for reducing risk. And that includes organizational management science, not simply physical technology. Fit for purpose. There are many diverse expressions of disaster risk reduction. We need to cater for all of those within the family of disaster risk reduction, not just give one single idea of what disaster risk reduction is. Everything needs to be ethical. Where does data come from? Who owns it? Who's getting the benefit of the training? And so on. Very, very important, often overlooked. Accessible. Who is able to fund attending these new programs? We're very proud of the international student body at UCL, but of course there are financial and cultural constraints that limit who can attend universities, and that's always a concern. This whole mission and this event is an example of community building. Education is an opportunity to build communities through alumni networks. That's how one makes change. And finally, perhaps the biggest gap is to connect institutions. At least in the UK, the model of education increasingly is one of competition between institutions, competing to attract students and research income. Maybe there's some advantage, it keeps us on our toes, but the goal is not to beat other institutions, it's to actually collaborate beneath that competition to build comprehensive communities of practice. So even if there's some degree of competition in the system, our students need to know how to collaborate. So on that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it very much. Next up, we have Professor Benjamin Ryan. I'm going to move us along a little a bit here to have a bit of time at the end. And Ben has been a key contributor to Making Cities Resilient 2030 community by contributing to the development of several important tools for local governments to support local planning for DRR. He was previously with Baylor University and now with Belmont University, and looking forward to learning about the tools. I will just say to everyone that, look, this is a small group and the speakers are available to you after the presentations as well and during the break, so you will have a lot of opportunity to ask your specific questions to them directly.
Thank you, Marla. So my name's Ben Ryan. I'm from Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. So if anyone here likes country music, our university is the home of country music. They even have annual US-wide Christmas events on campus for country musicians. So that's just a side note. I've had the pleasure over the last probably 10 years to work with Sanjay Bhatia in the office at UNDRR, the Global Education Training Institute. And during that period of time, we've been able to develop and apply different tools for DRR and assessment and planning. And I'll go through some of these. So the scorecard approach. So a lot of you may be familiar with the Disaster Resilience Scorecard for cities. This was developed in 2017, and this has now evolved into different thematical areas. The first one of those was public health, and I'll talk about a project that we had. But you can see the link here with the 10 essentials for making cities resilient, which is part of the Making Cities Resilient campaign. And within that, there's a scorecard or indicators often groups according to those 10 essentials. This helps report on progress at local government, provincial, and even to national levels. And then going through this scorecard process, you can garner that local level input, so community stakeholders, private sector, and different organisations to identify gaps and prioritise actions. So I'll talk about how we developed a method to prioritise these actions as part of a project funded by the World Health Organization, and there was another one funded by the United States Department of Agriculture. And then through this process, you can develop a strategy and an action plan. And the scorecard for your selected thematical area fits into these areas. It's application of the scorecard, and then you're identifying gaps and prioritising actions. And we are flipping the script here in that we're allowing practitioners and local level people to guide the strategies and action plans. And the reason we're doing that, this scorecard approach to increase disaster resilience is ideal for helping complex challenges. So in a complex challenge, you cannot solve it, you're looking to mitigate the impact or reduce the risk. So applying this method requires systems thinking. And through that, you can then inform strategic thinking. And then next up, you've got strategic planning. And previously, I worked in government in Australia at local, state, and federal levels. And I've also worked for the US government, where we'd be told to really get into strategic thinking, strategic planning. But what we need to do is do systems thinking first up. That's what the scorecard does. An example of that is Albert Einstein has a famous quote that if he had to solve a world's challenge, he would spend 55 minutes analysing the system, then coming up with a solution. Often we spend 55 minutes going for the solution and 5 minutes breaking down the system of the challenge. And you can see here, this brings in different perspectives: economics, society, geopolitics, environment, and technology. And then you can start to explore your strategy. So you spend your time at this front end doing systems thinking, then you can go in strategic planning. This can even inform foresight thinking as well. Then you come to decision making, and going through this, you can lead to action, which leads to the challenge being addressed. So this is what we would call a model of success, is really looking at that systems thinking aspect and building up through this process. And the scorecard is ideal to do that, to address disaster risk. And also we're expanding this into climate resilience in East Africa. And the systems approach using the scorecard, you can see there's a range of tools there now. I spoke briefly about the disaster resilience scorecard for cities. We then expanded that through Sanjaya Bhatia's leadership through UNDRR Getty into public health, and a group of us developed that. We launched this scorecard in April 2020, and that has since been translated into 15 languages. We've got the Food System Resilience Scorecard. That was developed as part of a United States Department of Agriculture project, and that's now in English, Portuguese, and I checked, I think, in the last week in Spanish as well. So thank you for the team for translation. And then we've got other ones that are in development and are available. So how we develop this scorecard method, this is really grounded in local level input and testing. This was part of a project where we evaluated the effectiveness of providing meals to children in rural areas of the United States impacted by school closures during the pandemic. So through this process, in consultation with the World Food Programme as well, we developed a pilot scorecard and rolled it out in these 5 different locations. You can see on the bottom right there, Montgomery, Alabama. They have used the recommendations on the local within the local school board and the Emergency Management Committee to focus in on what they're going to do to strengthen the food system in their community. And then the prioritisation. So we go through the scorecard. The workshop is probably 6 hours in total. So you start about 9 a.m, should be finished by 2 to 3 p.m. During the morning you go through the scorecard, get your scores, through a consensus-based process, determine if you agree with the scoring and the priorities. You then develop an objective for those 4 or 5 priorities and put them on this prioritisation matrix. And through this, with the local community members, you can really work through how feasible is this and what's the impact. So we're not turning up to decision makers, government agencies or funders saying here's 10 ideas. We can say we did a local level workshop or multiple workshops, went through a systematic process that is designed for unstructured discussion to collate that, and we can present these recommendations saying that we prioritise these as well based on feasibility and cost and impact. Now bringing it up to another level, so you could see in the United States we had application of the scorecard method for food systems. This is a project funded by the World Health Organization, the WHO Kobe Center to be accurate in Japan. We did 13 different workshops across 8 countries. This was rolling out the public health scorecard, and you can see the breadth of different areas where this is represented. Similar methodology to the food system one, and all the scorecards go through a similar process. In Waco, Texas, so this is in the heart of Texas, the middle of Texas, we rolled this out in October 2021. We came back 12 months later, and you can see on the left side of the screen is the lowest scoring issues. So that's where you've averaged the scores as a group, and then on the right are the recommendations or objectives the group developed, then they're ranked and prioritized. 12 months after this workshop, all the recommendations had been implemented. And then the bottom one there, which was really targeting in on faith-based organizations in Texas, the United States, was where they were starting to focus in on. So being inclusive was driven out of this workshop, which included engaging faith-based organizations in helping improve public health system resilience. So as part of this project, we did the 13 workshops, and we implemented a Delphi process. So we came to Incheon and we had a joint workshop. And in this joint workshop, we went through all the recommendations. There were 70 strategies presented to the group. This was over a 3-day period, so everybody got to present their findings from their workshop. And then we went through a consensus-based Delphi process to streamline the recommendations. And you can see there in phase 5, we ended up with 10 prioritised strategies after these workshops were applied. Now the scalability and versatility of this, we've just had 2 papers published with our colleagues in Turkey. They applied this public health scorecard as part of the WHO project, but they also recently applied it post-earthquake in the areas impacted by the earthquakes to guide the recovery of the public health system. So Professor Ismail Tayfor was the project lead of this. Interestingly, but just after the earthquakes, Professor Tayfor presented the findings of the initial workshops to the Prime Minister of Turkey. So they have national level interest within Turkey in using this approach to get local level insights to inform national level decisions around strengthening public health system resilience. And then in May this year, we were invited to Ukraine, to Lviv, to help strengthen the rehabilitation system, and Sanjaya kindly opened that session for us. And this is really designed about how can we use local level insights to recommend strategies for strengthening the rehabilitation system in Ukraine for people wounded during the war. And on the left there is a current project in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam and Lindi, where we have funding from USAID and UK FCDO as well to apply an education system resilience scorecard. We've done that in 4 locations, and I'll be there in 3 weeks, where we'll go through that Delphi process I spoke about earlier. And then in Alabama now, they're looking at nuclear preparedness, so they're bringing on 2 more nuclear reactors in the state of Georgia, and they really just wanted to look at our radiation preparedness. And you could see FEMA was involved in that workshop as well, and that was really helping improve medical preparedness for nuclear and radiation type incidents. So moving towards local resilience. So this is going local to global, not global to local, local to global. And you can see here, the scorecard really is well designed to do a local resilience assessment using multiple stakeholders at that local level to inform development of strategies and action plans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Jinqiang Chen, who is Urban Development Specialist at ADB. ADB provides support to cities across Asia to help them become more resilient and sustainable in the face of climate change. And he's going to let you know all of the capacity building that they can support.
All right. Thank you very much, Marla. Good morning again, and Jinqiang Chen from Asian Development Bank. You can call me JC. Today I'm going to discuss about the disaster risk management from a multilateral development bank perspective, particularly from ADB perspective. So ADB covers the Asia and the Pacific, and this area is highly prone to disasters. So although Asia hosts more than half of the world population, it is at the same time also very prone to the disaster impact. So looking backward, in the past 50 years, disasters triggered by the natural hazards have affected people, over 7 billion people, and has caused more than 2 million casualties and caused significant economic losses. And the value is significantly higher than the international global average. And in the last decade, there are almost 90,000 people died from the natural hazards, and there are significant economic losses, and this is equivalent to more than 180 million US dollar losses per day. So faced by these very significant challenges caused by the disaster triggered by the natural hazards, ADB developed its own disaster and emergency assistance policies to manage the disaster risks in the region. We start from the good understanding of the disaster risk analytics, and start from the disaster risk reduction. So disaster risk reduction is engages structural and non-structural measures to prevent hazards and to reduce exposure and to reduce vulnerability. So this is intrinsically embedded into the development process. And I just want to echo what Marla mentioned at the beginning of this session, that the risks is a function of the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And the exposure and vulnerability are anthropogenic factors. So that's the reason why we try to avoid naming the natural disasters, because in this way we overlook the anthropogenic impact in the formulation of the disasters. However, not all the disaster risks can be reduced, or some of the disaster risks are too expensive to be reduced. So there are always residual risks that to be managed. So we engaged disaster preparedness and disaster response, disaster risk financing to manage those residual risks to lower the impact. Once the disaster happens, ADB also provides timely support to effectively support the disaster response. And in this process, we also fully mainstream disaster risk reduction consideration in the recovery process to ensure the build back better. So far, ADB's portfolio on the disaster risk management stands over 6.5 billion US dollar. Most of them are to support the disaster recovery, but at the same time, we are also spend a lot of resources for disaster risk reduction, and the lowest portion is for disaster risk financing. We have several different products to support the disaster risk management, including the loans and also contingency disaster financing, emergency assistance loans, and the grants, including technical assistance. This figure shows us the relationship between the impact and the return period, or the frequency of the natural hazard. And as we mentioned earlier, the most cost-effective approach to reduce the impact is through the DRR, disaster risk reduction, that can reduce the impact to a certain level where the disaster risk reduction is no longer cost-efficient. Then once, for those residual risks, what the government can normally do is first to return those high-frequent, low-impact disaster risks. So basically to accept those risks. They can return those risks by using their contingency funding. And for those moderate frequent hazard with moderate impact, we can help our government to transfer those risks through the insurance companies or the capital market. And for those very rare risks that has a high impact, and it's often very expensive to transfer those risks to the capital market. And in that case, it is where the international assistance can play a major role to support the government. And if you look at the 234, it shows basically also lays out the layered approach for the disaster risk financing, basically informing the government how they can best utilize their resources to support or to manage disaster risks. However, I also want to emphasize that the delivery mechanism, because here we talk about how the government can mobilize the resources, funding to support disaster risk management. But at the same time, once a disaster happens in the disaster response, how government need to effectively to support those affected people is also key to ensure social resilience. So from that aspect, there are three aspects. From that aspect, there are three factors that we need to take into consideration. First is we need to provide timely support. And second is we need to ensure that the support are delivered to the affected people, because often there are targeting errors. So in the social protection scheme, sometimes the affected people are not getting supported, and those unaffected people get supported. So this targeting error will weaken the social resilience. And the third one is the fairness, because sometimes government provide uniform support to the affected people, but this support might not be enough for some people's recovery. For example, if SME, micro, small sized enterprises suffer from a disaster, if we just provide a very minimum amount, maybe it's not enough for them to recover. And from that end, those SME will go into a significant debt that they need to suffer. So we talk about the integrated, we talk about the different disaster risk reduction and also residual risk management. So in total, they comprise the integrated disaster risk management that ADB promotes. Over here, we all know that those disaster risk management measures, they have a direct benefits. They can reduce the casualty, they can reduce the asset loss, etc. However, we would like to also highlight there are co-benefits associated with the disaster risk management measures, including the economic value and also the co-benefits of the development manifest in the environmental, social, and governance. For example, if we convert a disaster-prone area to a non-disaster prone area, then it will increase the land value, and the government can capture those land value in its evaluation. And also some of the disaster risk management measures can have environmental, social, governance impact. For example, by growing a forest can reduce the landslide. At the same time, it can protect biodiversity. By implementing the community-based disaster risk management, implementing the community-based disaster risk management can enhance the social and community coherence. By implementing the big data or to utilize, for example, catastrophe bond, it will force the government, different departments to work together to share information and increase the transparency. And from that end, it also increases the governance. So over here, this kind of aspect is very meaningful, and the meaning is manifested in twofold. The first one is once we talk with the decision makers, by recognizing those co-benefits, will help them to correct the impression that disaster risk management interventions are non-profitable. Some of them, if you capture them well, if you design them well, they can also bring the economic benefits. And also another aspect of the meaning of this approach is because the direct benefits of the disaster risk management measures basically is contingent on the occurrence of disaster. And the occurrence of the disaster is also the output from disaster models which are not perfect. So if the model is not perfect, then there might be overinvestment or underinvestment of our disaster risk management investments. From that end, the policymakers might be prone to mistakes, errors when they make the decision. However, by incorporating the economic benefits and the ESG benefits into their decision-making process, it will lower the impact of wrong decision-making. So from that perspective, it will improve the robustness of their decision-making process. So coming back, so after recognizing the direct benefits and the co-benefits, then and also after the decision makers are exposed to a wide range of disaster risk management options, what the decision maker need to prioritize given the limited budget, including the financial budget and human resource budget. So we are promoting a cost-effective approach for the prioritization. Basically, first is we need to define the objective, understanding what are the disaster the government wants to manage and what are the boundary of the analysis. The second one is based on the scope, what kind of measures need to be proposed. And the third one is to select the benefits, indicators and metrics from the 3 dividends that we mentioned earlier. For example, if you look at the approaches to mitigate the hazard, the first dividend would be the how to avoid the losses, how much this intervention will avoid the losses of life, how much asset loss reduction will be made. And for the second one, there might be some economic benefits from the land value increase, and third one on the ESG. So the government needs to select the indicators and associated metrics. And then they need to estimate the benefits and normalize those values and aggregate the results. And the first one is to quantify the cost. And the figure in the bottom right shows an illustration that across the 13 measures within the budgets, which measures will be prioritized, which measures will be supported by the limited budgets. Then we do this analysis for the 3 dividends, and in the end, we can come up with this decision-making framework. So we will prioritize those interventions that are prioritized under the 3 dividends, and then we prioritize those interventions that gives a direct benefit and also one of the indirect benefits or one of the co-benefits, and then we less prioritize those interventions that do not generate the benefits or are not supported by the limited budget in each of the 3 dividend analysis. And in that end, we can select those interventions that can generate both the direct benefits and indirect benefits. In the end, we need to also assess the feasibility and their implementability. We do this analysis at this stage because instead of at the early stage, because we want to avoid a scenario that decision makers feel like, oh, this intervention is too complicated, we are too lazy to implement. So we put the feasibility analysis at this stage. ADB have provided some, also as I mentioned in the first slide, we also provide technical assistance to our developing member countries, and we often organize workshops and forums under the technical assistance. In the past, we have fostered the collaboration between 2 cities in China and 2 cities in Cambodia, and those 2 pair cities signed a MOU for resilient city development, and they focused on the disaster risk management, disaster response, tourism, and education. We also fostered collaboration between the PRC and the Mongolia to manage the steppe and the forest fire, etc. All those outcomes are generated from the forum and the workshop that we organized. And through these events, we learned that there are key challenges faced by the local governments, including the lack of financial resources and technical experts, and they have limited access to the reliable risk information, and the siloed operations and the poor interinstitutional collaboration. This one is significantly higher in large countries. And they also have challenges in their social inclusivity. We all know that gender, age, and the income and disability are very key factors for effective disaster resilience. However, we have to admit that those information are in some countries are not publicly available, or they are available at a very high aggregated level, and they are not geo-referenced. So it became very challenging for the decision makers to make customized solutions to help those people in either the disaster risk reduction, disaster response, or disaster preparedness. And the last is they also emphasize that the continuity of the capacity building events is also an issue. So as a multilateral development bank, what we can offer is to first strengthen their financial mechanism, including providing financial support to our developing member countries, and also helping them to expand their financial access by linking them with the insurance companies, helping them issue the catastrophe bonds, etc. We can also help them to to develop financial regulations to help them better manage their internal resources to deal with a different type of disaster risks at different frequency level. We also provide a capacity building program to help them to build the capacities to strengthen their institutional capacity, etc. We also engage the technology and innovation. We promote the big data, artificial intelligence, the building information modeling, city information modeling, digital twin in our projects. We foster the institutional the governance and the coordination. ADB provides the policy-based loan to DMC countries to help them to improve the policy. And last is we also foster our cross-border collaboration. So ADB has recently signed the agreement with MCR 2030, so ADB is now a partner with MCR. So from that end, we see that there is numerous opportunities for ADB and MCR to collaborate together to support the disaster resilience improvement and the building in our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Okay, and going to move to our last but not least speaker, Michelle Chivunga. Global Policy House, which she's the Chief Executive Officer of, promotes digital financing and policy solutions and cutting-edge emerging technology innovations for sustainable development. Ms. Chivunga is well known for her work in digital transformation and blockchain, and has advised governments and international agencies on these topics. And as, of course, many of you will be joining tomorrow for the training day, in which you'll be able to learn more about the tools and the resources from these speakers. So over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How are we feeling? I can't hear anybody. Good morning. That's better. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Michelle Chivunga, and I'm the CEO of Global Policy House, as introduced. It's a real honor to be here. I'm based in London. Came through, I'm trying to work out whether I'm supposed to be awake or asleep, depending on the time zones, but it's a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for being with us. I think in terms of, we've heard a lot around disaster risk. I think my presentation really is very much more around how can we actually leverage technology to support the reduction bit that you talked about, Marla. I think that's quite important. So how do we leverage new and emerging technologies, for example? I'm sure many people in this room must have heard about artificial intelligence. How many people have heard about AI? Not many people in this room. Okay, there's a few people. That's great, right? So emerging technologies, we've heard a lot about technology. We've heard the world is going digital. We've heard the world is very much leveraging data, but what does that actually mean? And what does that mean in the context of DIR is very, very important. That is where I'm going to cover a little bit on what that actually means. So before I get into all of that, I think one of the things I'd like to do is to contextualize, to really contextualize, to say where are we at today in the world, right? We have what we call a very VUCA geopolitical environment. What do I mean by VUCA? It's very volatile, it's quite uncertain, it's complex environments that we are working in and dealing with, and they're very, very ambiguous as well. So how do we deal with that environment? How do we start to continue to do our work, whether it's risk reduction, whether it's managing climate challenges? How do we manage doing that successfully in this kind of environment that we find ourselves in? Where, of course, we've come from the history of COVID. All of us, faced COVID. We couldn't stand here. 2 years ago or so, we were not able to see each other. We were not able to be with family and friends. We had the issue now, of course, with conflict happening across the world. We've got the climate challenges that we are faced with. So we are in this VUCA, difficult geopolitical environment that we have to deal with. And we have to remember that even at a local government level, we have to manage the challenges that come with that. So for me, it's very important that as we start to look at the solutions and we start to look at how do we look at that reduction topic that we talked about earlier on, that we contextualize and we understand the environment we're in. The most exciting thing that I think, I'm a bit biased because I am in the digital world. I'm a technology advocate for sure. But one of the most exciting things for any country in the world is actually the digital revolution and what that digital revolution is bringing for countries to take advantage of and for local government to take advantage of. My colleagues have talked very, very well around the importance of local government, especially in terms of disaster risk reduction. Because at the end of the day, they are the implementers, right? They're the people who are doing and making sure that risk reduction is being undertaken. And it's very, very important that there are tools that can help local government to actually manage to deliver those ambitions. I think that's where the digital economy in particular is going to play a very significant role in this VUCA environment that I talk about, right? To be able to manage and to deliver the risk reduction that we want. So how do we go about doing that? Obviously, you've heard a little bit around the challenges that local government is already facing around risk reduction, but I'm talking about the challenges in the context of being able to be successful in this VUCA environment and being able to be successful in a digital economy, because we are living in a digital world. We're going to a digital futures, and many countries are more advanced than others and are leveraging these digital tools more than others. But we cannot leave certain countries behind. I really believe it's important that we all start to work collectively, and I think even with COVID, we learned that we cannot survive on our own. We have to work together. So in order to have that risk reduction we're talking about, very important that we start to look at ways to engage. And one way to engage, whether you're in South Korea, you're in London, you're in Paris, you're in Zambia, you're in Nigeria, you're able to communicate through digital platforms. And this is where the digital economy is coming in very, very strongly. Whether you're sharing best practice about risk reduction, whether you're starting to learn about what are the initiatives that Korea is doing. Yesterday was a phenomenal day because I listened to a lot of what the cities were doing in different parts of Southeast Asia, for example. And I learned quite a lot around the initiatives that were being implemented around risk reduction in different countries. We can share that practice digitally. We can start to create platforms, right, that allow us to share best practice with each other, which will in turn help countries to start to mitigate and manage and also do the reduction that we talked about. So how do we go about it? I mean, what are the challenges, especially from a more digital context? How do we prepare our cities, our local governments, to be able to take advantage of the digital tools that are there? And I think some of the challenges are very much around, do we have the right digital and physical infrastructure? Have we got the right policies and regulations in place to be able to take advantage of the digital infrastructure? Do we have enough digital skills? Are we training our local government to understand, have the right digital skills, digital capability to be able to take advantage of the digital tools that I talk about, right, that are there for government to take advantage of? And then we talked about private-public partnerships, right? Collaboration was heard, you know, I think the 3 C's were mentioned yesterday: collaboration, coordination. But the collaboration bit and the private-public partnerships is significant to deliver on disaster risk. So how do we ensure we are able to do that? Again, I think, you know, digital tools can help with public-private partnerships and also collaboration, even international collaboration. Whether South Korea is now going to collaborate with Nigeria, or, you know, Nigeria is going to collaborate with China. You know, we have opportunity now, I think, with digital and with information and data to be able to do that in a more seamless manner. Then, of course, we talk about implementation. For me, it's all well and good to have policies and regulations, and they're all well written and they're sitting there. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to deliver on the ground, especially when it comes to hazards, especially when it comes to risk reduction. We have to be able to implement. So can we implement? Certainly, I think we can. Now, one of the things that we have been doing as an organization is we've been working very, very across the world really to help with digital upskilling, right? So talking about, you know, areas like artificial intelligence, we've heard about how AI can help with disaster risk, but what does that mean? We help to skill up, you know, whether it's local government or regulators, you know, or central banks, or, you know, local community officers that are working on the ground and delivering on the ground. We help with digital upskilling. We look at digital financing, alternative sources of finance and capital, because without capital and finance and investments, it's very hard to deliver what we want to be able to deliver, especially around risk reduction. Then do we have, of course, the right infrastructure? Can we look at new digital assets or financing that can help us to bridge the gap that we have, especially around capital and investment? And then we have our own digital trust framework that we've developed under Global Policy House for climate resilience, you know, for managing risk associated disasters and frameworks that we've designed to actually help to curate, to support that delivery of that reduction. Now, these economic growth indicators that I have highlighted here really comes from an MIT book, that chapter that I've written, that also speaks very strongly around how are the steps that you follow to be able to deliver on risk reduction, and the steps you follow to be able to take advantage of technologies that you can use as local government, right? You know, what are these technologies going to be able to do for you? How are you going to manage the fiscal, geopolitical environment? What are the strong leadership and governance models that you need as you practice your disaster risk applications? All this is kind of covered in the MIT book that we've covered. And some of these areas, these are indicators of how you can actually monitor and manage to be able to deliver on your risk reduction strategies that you have. And I highlight that chapter, which I can happily share with those that are interested. Then, of course, you know, we look at how do we now leverage technology? I've talked a lot around technology, but how do you do it? How? Is a question that we get a lot of the time, right? So this is really just more like an ecosystem approach in terms of how do we get to those risk-free environments? How do we get to the reduction bit? You know, and you see here from this model that I've designed is very much around, look at supporting and building those digital platforms. Some countries already have the digital platforms. They're engaging, you know, intergovernment departments are talking to each other. A lot more information is being shared, data is being shared, so it's a lot more transparent and seamless. In other parts of the world, it's not the same thing because we don't have those platforms in place, so we have to establish and develop the platforms. And then from establishing those platforms or from existing infrastructure that is there, we also have to say, is that infrastructure accurate, or do we have to optimize using different technologies, whether it's AI or smart contracts? You know, what does that all mean? How can we orchestrate or update our existing infrastructure, create new infrastructure that can help us to get to that risk-free environment that we want, or the reduction that we want? We must co-create, and what I mean by co-create, we must work with each other. We must work with the systems. You know, somebody talked about systems thinking, absolutely fundamental. We must be able to collaborate and work with each other to co-create new platforms, new methodologies, new mechanisms, and new initiatives that support disaster risk reduction. And then what you do with technology, to be honest, technology really is just a tool. You know, I know it's very exciting and everybody talks about the shiny AIs and, you know, what ChatGPT has done and, oh, hey, I've downloaded my ChatGPT. But really, ultimately, it's up to the human interaction to be able to design It is different technology applications, and you have to infuse technology with other applications, whether it's the human element or you're bringing in, environmental strategies, sustainable strategies. It's very important that you bring in the technology which will help you to infuse and put everything together and help to deliver. So you hear about things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, smart contracts, robotics, data, Internet of Things. These are all tools that we can utilize as local government to be able to help us become more efficient, more productive, and be able to deliver, right, more effectively in terms of risk reduction. But each of these technologies I'm telling you about have specific functions and utilization that you can use at particular points in your journey towards your risk reduction strategy. And each one of those needs to have very, very clear, I would say, capacity building and education, so you're able to understand, where do I leverage, where do I use AI, where do I use blockchain, where do I use robotics, and when? And what are the, indicators of success, right? Because you can be deploying blockchain or machine learning models that actually have no effect and are costing you quite a lot of money. So very, very important to understand where they actually have an impact. And then, of course, you get to those risk-free ecosystems, which are very much community-based, ensuring that communities are benefiting, personalized services, seamless operations, and very much citizen and data-driven outcomes that we want to achieve. Finally, also, we talk about investment a lot. I cover investments in my firm. We are expanding and trying to create a fund, actually, to support more investments towards disaster risk, climate-related issues. But we also understand that the world is changing. Yeah, the future of money is changing. We're going to see money in different forms. Money is going to be digitized. Money is going to come in, move away from sort of the traditional cash to more digitized forms of money. And as a result of that, we're also seeing new forms of capital and investments that we can tap on to help us to manage with the disaster risk challenges around financing. Now, here's just a small chart that shows you the evolution of money and where we're heading, right? Even in terms of technology and digital financing, we're starting to see a shift where more and more countries and people are starting to look at alternative sources of capital, and that's what this graph is showing. For us at Global Policy House, what do we actually do, in order for us to support and help with risk reduction? So we've worked with several governments around the world, around climate resilience frameworks that we've designed. We are also very heavy around the policies and ensuring that there's effective policies that are designed to help to mitigate and to help government to actually deliver on that risk reduction ambitions. So we've worked across, for example, the government of Bermuda, looking at biodiversity, looking at their fintech strategy and technology strategy to deploy and use in terms of their own disaster risk management and climate resilience. Then across the African continent, I don't know how many people know much about the African continent in this room. I think you do. Africa is not one Africa. We are one Africa, but it's not one country. So we have 54 countries. And from those 54 countries, we've been working across the governments in the 54 countries to say, look, how do we come together as a collective, as one African Union, to help to mitigate against challenges we have with accessing capital that can help, for example, with disaster issues, can help with climate-related issues. Africa faces quite a lot of challenges, especially when it comes to climate-related issues. We're facing drought, we're facing flooding, and they don't have the same resources or capital to be able to manage with those challenges. So coming as a collective to say, how do we source capital, how do we source finance, and how do we actually bring solutions and digital applications to actually help mitigate against that is work that we've been doing with a lot of the African countries. Also, the African countries have come together and unified through a new I'll say policy instrument, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is bringing together the whole continent with the ambition of tackling these issues together. And also being able to be a bit more competitive and working with the rest of the world on these issues around disaster risk, climate-related issues, and also managing the issues with capital and finance as well. So we've worked quite heavily with countries in Africa to support. Now, a lot of the impacts that result from things like disasters, whether it's COVID or hazards, are really felt very, very strongly in developing economies. And these developing economies don't really have the same levels of resistance or resilience building, right, that we need to be able to support a lot more. And on the social side, I heard somebody, I think my colleagues talk a little bit more around the social impacts. We're also very passionate about the social side. And that is why we have also invested on gender-led, sort of investments that help to mitigate some of the challenges that are felt on the social side, for example, by women in rural areas, women who have been impacted as a result of climate-related issues, droughts, not able for them to be able to go and trade and do business in their local agricultural markets, selling their tomatoes, their oranges. Very, very difficult in the environments that we face ourselves in. So the impacts of some of the disasters that we face, the hazards that we face, the conflicts that we face, are actually felt by a lot more by the women. And that's why for us at Global Policy House, we've actually just launched quite recently with the UN, the 10 million women in digital. And the ambition with that is really to have to mainstream women within the artificial intelligence space, in the digital space, to help to mitigate against the risks that come, including risk reduction. And finally, this slide really just highlights to you some of the core themes and areas that we cover at Global Policy House. We're very heavy, of course, on the digital side, on the technology side, and helping to educate everybody to understand what do we mean when we talk about artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, blockchain, data. Everything is about data at the end of the day. Everything is going to be fueled by data, but you need to understand what do we mean by data. How can we read our data sets? What is the data telling us? The data is the one to inform you to say, okay, we take this action, we make this decision, and we need to be able to have the data sets. Some countries have the data sets, but they're not digitized. They're all in paper form, so very difficult to read. We need to digitize the data so that we can use machine learning, we can use artificial intelligence to read those data sets for us and tell us what is the next action. We can actually mitigate a lot of the disasters that have not actually happened yet. But we can use data to say, no, in 10, 15 years, we see this is potentially happening, and we can help to mitigate because we can use technologies to try and look at the trends that are being set. But ladies and gentlemen, we have a class tomorrow where we go into a bit more detail around this. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, and that is all I have from myself. Any questions, please reach out.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a sense, as I do, that as complex as the problems you face are, we have had some pieces of the puzzle revealed up here today. So we're working on capacity development in a very challenging environment. Do any of you have any burning questions that you would like to address to all of our speakers today? Don't be shy, go ahead. Raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone. Yeah.
Good morning. I have a question to you, especially on the technology part. So when we are going for urban planning, these models have been applied in Africa, as you said, and how this can be scaled up in other parts of the world with the partnership of your institutions and other institutions. The two institutions, the model of any institution which wishes to have this kind of an engagement with you. The second is that how the governance is accepting this technology for the planning purposes, their adaptability and also their ownership. And the second question to ADB. ADB is largely helping the government in terms of loan and assistance and TA and so on and so forth. How the other institutions can become the periphery of the partnerships. If any private organization, we say the public-private partnership, and also when we talk about the civil society groups, how these two can be engaged with the ADB assistance in the country. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask our panelists, starting from the far end towards me, one by one, please take this opportunity to take a couple of minutes to, add to your comments, sum up or reflect, and we'll give everybody a couple minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. Absolutely, I think the Africa model, so I think your question was more around scalability, right? And being able to have similar models across the world, in other parts of the world. That's the first part of your question. I think in Africa, how we've really looked at it is because, of course, Africa, like I said, has 54 countries. Each of them has very different levels of development. You have the big Nigeria, you've got the smaller Lesotho, you've got the small, the medium sort of Zambia, right? So it's very difficult, I think, for these countries individually to be able to manage some of the challenges that we have. And what we're saying is that it's important we collaborate. And in order for us to scale some of the solutions that are there already, we need to be able to collaborate, whether you're creating your own investment pools to support with disaster risk, or you're working at sub-regional level to support and create those solutions is very, very important. But again, back to my point around how we can leverage digital for scalability, because we can, right? So I'm sitting here in Seoul, 2020, I could not sit here in Seoul. In fact, I was working already with the UNDRR to do courses, but we did them digitally. We did them virtually. We did data courses virtually, and we didn't meet face-to-face, but we were still able to deliver, what we wanted to deliver virtually. So I think it's important that in order for us to scale and to share best practice and solutions, that we also communicate better with each other in different countries, and digital is there to help to facilitate that. So companies like ours, we're working, of course, with the UN to be able to do that more, so that we share information, we share best practice, and that way we can start to scale and introduce new initiatives. Your second question is around the technology part. I think, like I said, technology is an enabler. No matter what tech you're thinking about, whether it's AI or it's blockchain, smart contract, it's an enabler. But to use that enabler, to use that tool, you need to know how to use it. It's like you buy a new fridge, right? Or you buy a new microwave. You want to know, how do you use the functions? It's the same thing with the technologies. Every single one of these technologies is backed by data. So the quality of the technology, the quality of the outputs will matter based on the data that you're using to input into the technology. So if you have good data sets, healthy data sets, you're going to get some very good results. And the tech will even read the sets for you. So you don't really have to do that much, I think, as a human, which is the beauty of it. I hope that answers the question. Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
Let's keep down the continue, please, so everybody gets a chance. We can.
I can answer it afterwards, no problem.
Great, thank you very much for your question to ADB. So regarding those concerned stakeholders, ADB's, our direct clients are mainly two. One is the sovereign entity, so the government. Another one is the private sector. So once we are providing whatever supports or products to our clients, the government is naturally involved, and also they are often involved in the programming process. So we are planning the future pipeline projects in advance by consultation with the government. So they are naturally involved in this process. Then regarding academia, they can be involved in ADB's operations through consultancy services. And we also form a partnership with academic institutes to develop knowledge products. In terms of the private sector, they are also another avenue of our client, and we also provide the lendings to our private sector as well. At the same time, we also fosters public-private partnership. We have advisory services to the government to design the PPP projects. And you also mentioned about the social societies. They can be involved, in the project design. And once we design the project, mainly the sovereign projects, and we can help the government to formulate some mechanisms that can effectively engage the social societies in their disaster risk management mechanism. So that's how I see that we can engage those concerned stakeholders. And of course, in in practice, we should also organize this type of a forum and workshops to bring together the government stakeholder, the government, academia, private sector, social societies, all together to conceptualize or to discuss the challenges, to share the good practices so that people will, once they design the project, once they make the decisions, they can think comprehensively of all the possible solutions. I think that's something that we often engage those stakeholders. I hope I addressed your question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everybody for the contributions, and the scorecard method that I spoke about, I think that can be really helpful to garner local insights going beyond government. Most people in societies don't work in government. People work in private sector, they pay taxes, that pays for government. So the scorecard can really break the back in not focusing on government, but engaging whole of society. So that's including everybody, private sector, schools, school children, and teachers. You can also engage faith-based organisations. An example of where I've seen this work really well was when I was working as an emergency manager in northeastern Australia in a place called Cairns. We had our hospital on the waterfront. It had been impacted by a cyclone just before I joined the role, and they wanted to adjust the community, our response or our preparedness. So I engaged clinicians. We realised we didn't want to evacuate the hospital unless we had to. And previously, the default was to evacuate. So the default now was to shelter in place based on clinical input. We had a workshop where we engaged local government engineers and community members. The community didn't want to relocate the hospital, they wanted to keep things as it was. And then we found out that the sewage pump station for the hospital was lower than the hospital. So we did not know that when we were talking in our silo, so that changed our threshold. It was based on the sewage pump station. And the other one was the evacuation road to the airport. If you had to evacuate, that was lower than the hospital as well. So by having this multi-sectoral approach, we were able to identify risks we wouldn't have been able to identify by ourselves. And that was engaged in the community. And fast forward, as a result of that, a purpose-built site was made inland that wasn't subject to flooding, could withstand Category 5, and was supported by the community, and now provides renal dialysis treatment and other primary healthcare conditions, because that community where it got located to is a very vulnerable, low-income community. So without this multi-sectorial approach, which the scorecard drives, it can be really hard for us to meet community needs. And just in conclusion, I think this method, again, can really help you meet where the community is. And that's something I think we really need to do as disaster risk reduction practitioners, researchers, and government officials. Go to the community and work out what they need and meet those needs.
So let me pick up from the colleague's comment on data. So I couldn't agree more. It's indeed all about the data. And an awareness that already the data that we tend to use is quite skewed. Most of the data that we use talks to physical attributes of hazard and physical vulnerability, much less around social attributes of vulnerability. So there is indeed a danger, possibly, and it would be great to discuss this tomorrow, in using more and more sophisticated tools for data analysis, yet not addressing the gap in data that's available that could move us towards an increasingly technocentric, physical science-based approach to reducing risk, which is fantastic. One wants to have the best technology, the best engineering and architecture to prevent buildings from suffering harm, but not if we ignore the social processes that also lead to people's sensitivity to harm. So that's one reflection on the excitement, but also the danger of rushing into this enhanced technology. On the flip side, reflecting on our own methodologies, we've found that technology is indeed quite liberating. So we start from the perspective of asking communities at risk what future they want. So very much grounded in the perspectives of local actors. If one takes those perspectives and presents them to policymakers, it's rather difficult to act on. But if one can change the presentation of those perspectives into a digitized form, a GIS map, for example, suddenly this is in the language that policymakers can understand. It's a language of data that hazard analysts can understand, and one advances the conversation. So it's a very delicate balance. Without that technology that can use digitized data sets, we miss an opportunity to project community voice into policy making. But without putting the community voice first, we could fall into the other trap, of course, of leaving them behind. Thank you.
Wow, it's very exciting. I want to just reflect back that at the beginning of the first day, we had a strong message that said, collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. And today, we have a very strong message that says, you, as leaders in local government, are the most important people in making this happen. That might be a little bit scary to hear. You might have thought coming into this that this was going to be somebody else's responsibility. But the clear message is that we are all going to be relying on your leadership. The great news, of course, is that you have opportunities to collaborate. We have higher education programs. We have tools for local adaptation. We have investments and financing and knowledge products. We have ability to support us in leveraging new technologies. So it is complex, but I urge you to work on these collaborations. This is the takeaway. And hopefully we will leverage the engagement of our local communities and participation with data and evidence that they can use themselves, that you can use for planning and decision making. Best wishes to all of you for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all the speakers for sharing your insight with us. And our special thanks also go to our moderator for leading this session. Thank you very much. And you may return to your seat. So now we move on to the city networking event. 네, 여러분 이 시간 정말 풍성하게 채워주신 연사님들께 진심으로 감사를 드리겠습니다. 여러분 다시 한번 박수 부탁을 드려도 될까요? So would you please give another applause to them? Well, this session provided us with a glimpse into the